Why did Anglo-Americans come to Texas in the 1820s? Um, and there is a because of course history is never simple, right? It can't just be a simple question. There is a corollary to the question. The corollary, of course, is why would Mexico allow it or even desire it? So that's the framework that we're going to sort of work around during the few minutes that I have to talk to you here this evening. And I thought that one Andrew mentioned about how mythologized uh, this particular snippet of Texas history has been. Uh, and so, as a sort of way to work around maybe some of that mythologizing, I thought that I would borrow a page from our friends, the immigration historians, which I am not one of, and use a concept that they often use, very elementary concept that immigration historians use. And so I'm going to introduce a couple of terms: push factors and pull factors. When we talk about push factors, we're simply talking about the conditions in an immigrant's country of origin, their home country, that are motivating them to leave. All right, pushing them out of their native country. And when we talk about pull factors, we're talking about those factors and conditions in the host country, the new destination, factors that drew people in, that pulled them in, that attracted them to that country instead of some other country, for example. So we're going to look at Texas in the 1820s through this lens. And so we'll begin by talking about push factors. Um, and in order to do that, of course, we need to talk about what's the situation in the United States. And the first and I think most important thing to keep in mind is that uh, conditions in the United States circa 1820 had undergone dramatic changes. Now, for the decade or so prior to 1820, cotton had boomed like never before. Um, you could make a fortune in cotton. And when I say a fortune, I really mean a fortune. You could make a fortune in cotton if you could get your hands on the right kind of land, fertile land, and if you could get the labor to work that land. And the labor had to be slave labor, because no free person would voluntarily work for a cotton planter, and no cotton planter wanted to hire a free person to do it. So if you could acquire land and slaves, you could in just and make a few good crops a few years in a row, you could become truly wealthy. The county that included Natchez, Mississippi, in 1820 was the wealthiest county per capita in the entire United States, wealthier than New York City. All right. Um, so that's sort of the backdrop in the United States. But in 1819, all of a sudden, the great times came to a jarring halt, uh, because the country entered the worst depression. They called depressions panics in those days. So the Panic of 1819 struck the United States with a vengeance, and all the things that go along with sudden recessions or depressions: massive unemployment, terrible hard times all around. Now, the Panic of 1819 coincided with a very important change in U.S. government policy. In the past, prior to 1820, you could buy the abundant public lands in the western United States from the United States government, and they would sell them to you on credit. So that had meant that even a relatively poor farmer could buy a small farm in the public domain. That policy changed in 1820, and the United States government began making 80 acres of the public domain available. They actually lowered the price to $1.25 an acre. So for $100, you could buy an 80-acre farm, but there was a catch. You had to pay cash up front. They stopped offering credit. And in the condition of the Panic of 1819, most Americans couldn't. I mean, $100 could be a year's salary for a working man. So most people didn't have a year's salary just lying around in their couch cushions. So, so hard times and this change in land policy against the background of knowing that cotton, you can still make a fortune in cotton if you can get land and labor to work it. So those are our push factors. What about our pull factors? Well, we need to, of course, look at the situation in Mexico. And I know that you've already talked about the events that lead to the Mexican Wars for Independence in a previous week. So I'll go really fast through this. The situation in 1820 in Mexico is that Mexico is on the verge of winning its independence from Spain after a full decade of bloody warfare. In 1821, Mexico finally wins that independence, but things were far from secure, should we say, in Mexico. Just in the immediate aftermath of independence. For one thing, Spain for the next decade would constantly threaten a reinvasion, so there was always that to worry about. But particularly worrisome in the northern parts of newly independent Mexico were Indians. This was the Comanche Empire, as one prominent historian has called it in a recent award-winning book. And the Comanche Indians really called the shots over a large swath of what would later become Texas. And from this, and you can see on this map, this is sort of the homeland of the Comanches, but they were constantly launching raids far beyond these boundaries, all the way into what is today northern Mexico proper. Texas had always been a sort of afterthought for the Spanish government and now for the newly independent Mexican government. It was terribly underpopulated. Texas had three basic settlements, and you can see the map here. Nacogdoches, way over in East Texas, was virtually abandoned in 1821. It had been trashed so much during the wars for independence. San Antonio, and then La Bahia, that would later become known as Goliad. These three settlements total maybe had a population of 2,500, probably less than that. And so the entire non-Indian population of Texas was not even 3,000 people. This meant that for the Mexican government, Texas was constantly in danger. For one thing, it was in danger potentially from the rapidly expanding United States. And of course, the Indians, again, are really calling the shots in Texas. This leads us, of course, to these iconic characters in Texas history. Moses Austin, a Missouri lead mining magnate, and his son, Stephen Austin. And I'm not going to go through the whole Moses Austin, Stephen Austin story. You guys teach this. You know the story about Moses Austin losing his fortune in the aftermath of the Panic of 1819, coming to San Antonio unannounced, laying a proposal before the at that point still Spanish government to introduce 300 American families into Texas. He dies before he gets a chance to actually launch the venture, which is approved, and it falls to his 26-year-old son Stephen to actually launch this colonization enterprise. Stephen Austin barely got to San Antonio before he realized that Mexican independence meant that he would need to have his father's concession confirmed by the new Mexican government. He goes to Mexico City, thinks he'll be there a few weeks, ends up being there a full year, getting his father's contract approved by the new government. It's 1823 before he is back in Texas and really starts launching his colony. Um, Austin, though, becomes the first impresario of Texas. There would eventually, after that first contract issued by the national government, it became the job of the state governments in the northern provinces to issue impresario contracts, colonization contracts. That word impresario, by the way, simply translates as colonization agent. Much more impressive sounding to say impresario, but it really just means colonization agent in those days, in that setting. And eventually the new state of Coahuila in Texas, Texas is joined with the state of Coahuila, and you can see it on the map here. That orange, amorphous orange blob there is the modern northern Mexican state of Coahuila, joined to parts of the modern state of Texas into one state, with its capital way down in the southern part of Coahuila at Saltillo. The federal government writes its new constitution, of course, and eventually there would be about 40 impresario contracts issued for Texas. And you see some of them right here. Most of those impresarios never did a thing. They got their contracts and never introduced a single settler. A few of them had some modest success, but Austin was the big kahuna of impresarios. He introduced probably 10 times as many settlers as the next competitor in the impresario system. In all, Austin signed 5 colonization contracts. That first one with the federal government, and then 4 more with the state government. Now, we're supposed to be talking about pull factors. Of course, it's the impresario system really that's the pull factor. All right. So let's talk a little bit about this impresario system. Under the system, a settler to Austin's colony, and this was pretty much the case in other colonies, could inform the government that they intended to be a stock raiser, a livestock raiser, and if that was their declaration, they could receive a Mexican league of land, and a league was 4,428 acres. They could also announce their intention to farm, in which case they could get a Mexican labor. It's spelled like the word labor in English, a Mexican labor of land, which was 177 acres. Not surprisingly, most of Austin's colonists decided that, well, we'll be stock raisers and farmers, so we will get a league and a labor of land. So do the math, 4,428 acres, 177 acres, right at 4,600 acres of land to round it off. Now, really important point here. How much land is 4,600 acres? Well, it's a lot, okay? You do the math, it's a little dab over 7 square miles of land. Now, my family owns a cotton farm in West Texas. We own 1,000 acres, and I think of that as a pretty big farm. I can't imagine, and of course, they didn't have tractors to work that land, right? So think about 4,400 acres, and we'll talk more about it when we get to the primary source discussion later. Just keep in mind that this is a massive domain of land. 4,600 acres. Some of the largest planters in the deep South didn't come anywhere near having 4,400 acres. 400 acres was a nice sized plantation in Mississippi or Louisiana. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. That's a very strong pull factor. And of course, Austin's colony, located in the watersheds of the lower watersheds of the Brazos and Colorado River, was some of the best cotton growing land anywhere. On a level with some of the best cotton growing lands of the Deep South. With this, and here's the other real kicker about these impresario grants. Uh, the land was basically free. You did have to pay some minor fees to the government and to the impresario. You had to pay to have the land surveyed. You had to pay for official title. And all in all, if you got your 4,600 acres of land, your 7 square miles of land, your Ligue and your Labor, the fees would be about $100 in American money, about the same that you would pay for the 80 acres in the United States. But Stephen F. Austin did not require cash up front. In the early years of his colony, he generously extended credit. And in fact, when he died, and his will was probated many years later, he had hundreds of accounts receivables, IOUs, from settlers who, after all these years, still hadn't paid their fees. So many of these, and most of them never did. So basically, this was free land. So there's your pull factors. Settlers poured in, but with these settlers came problems. Of course, there were Indian issues. Whoops, get ahead of myself. There were Indian issues. Austin's initial grants were in areas that only had a few small nomadic tribes, like the Karankawas and the Tonkawas, and some other small tribes. But it was really outside the main boundaries of Comancheria, of the Comanche Empire. Austin's policy was to try to get along with Indians, but if they wouldn't cooperate, he didn't hesitate to make war on them, and he ended up conducting some fairly brutal campaigns against the Indians. Really, a sort of ethnic cleansing policy is almost what it became. So Indians are one problem. But if you had asked Stephen F. Austin, what's been your biggest problem, he would have said, and in fact did say on a number of occasions, of all the problems I had to deal with, the biggest one was the colonists themselves. They were an unruly, independent-minded, individualistic set of mostly American frontiersmen. And it wasn't long before there were problems. The problems most notably exhibited themselves over in East Texas, outside of Austin's colony, where an American named Hayden Edwards got a grant, got an impresario grant. We can go back and you can see. Oh no, it's not on this map, but anyway, he got a map that included the village of Nacogdoches and some of the surrounding areas. Edwards did not share the diplomatic nature of Stephen F. Austin. Austin was a great diplomat and really sort of knew how to manage these unruly colonists. Hayden Edwards got there and expected everybody in his colony, including many of the old settlers who'd been there longer than he was, expected them to sort of bow down to him like he was the great and mighty Hayden Edwards, the impresario. After a few months of him being on the ground in his colony, his own settlers and many of the old settlers who had been there before were in open revolt against him. He and his followers, who he gathered around him, finally said they'd had enough, and they declared the independence of that part of Texas and called it the Fredonian Republic. This was a terrible blow to Stephen F. Austin. We'll talk more about it later when we look at our primary sources. But long story short, Austin has to call out his own militia, his own volunteers. They march with some Mexican troops, they marched to East Texas to put down the rebellion, and it's easily put down. Edwards and his followers basically head for the hills once they realize there's gonna be a fight. The Fredonian Rebellion, this sort of comic opera episode, the Fredonian Rebellion seems almost laughable to us, but it was of major importance in this history because it sent a severe wake up call to the government in Mexico City. Um, the Realizing that these American colonists have not really assimilated. They have not become the good Mexicans that the government wanted them to and expected them to, and that Austin had promised they would. Maybe Austin's colonists had, but these other colonists in other impresario colonies, not so much, right? And of course, it took a little while for the bureaucratic wheels, to turn in Mexico City. But eventually, Mexico decided they needed to do something about it. Okay, something about Texas. Now, one of the first things they do in 1827, they pass an anti-slavery bill. This is in the state legislature, actually, down in Saltillo, that prohibited the further introduction of slaves into Texas, and declared all children born thereafter to slaves to be free at birth. But the next year, Stephen Austin manages to get a law passed that permitted Americans to bring in indentured servants. And so they started bringing in their indentured servants for life, a 99-year contract of bound labor. It was a workaround, it was a subterfuge to allow slavery to continue. But then in 1829, the next year, the new president of Mexico, Vicente Guerrero, issued a nationwide emancipation proclamation, freeing all the slaves in Mexico. Texans immediately panicked. Stephen Austin managed to get Texas exempted from the law. But by then, the wheels had turned, and Mexico is ready to do something even more serious. In 1828, they send a renowned soldier and statesman and scientist named Manuel de Mieri Terán to Texas on a fact-finding mission. Terán's his ostensible mission was to survey the border between Texas and the United States, but his secret instructions were to study the situation in Texas and make a report back to the government in Mexico City, explaining what recommendations he would make to draw Texas closer to Mexico to prevent the potential loss of Texas. Mieri Terán spent a full year in Texas, and he finally returned to Mexico. And his report was very alarming to the Mexican government. First of all, he realized that the population of Anglo Americans had grown like crazy. There were now over 20,000 Anglo Americans. They outnumbered native Mexicans, Tejanos, better than 5-1. And Terán then he realized that the Indians were still a potential problem. He understood that the border between the United States and Texas was porous, to say the least. And so he made a number of recommendations, and these ended up being put into a law passed by the Mexican Congress called the Law of April 6, 1830. And it embodied most of Terán's recommendations. So the most important of these for our purposes are as follows. First of all, the law announced that it would end Anglo immigration to Texas. This, of course, panicked Austin and many others who were counting on continuing immigration. Austin again interceded with the government and managed to get the colonization contracts like his own that were still in progress to be completed. But once the existing contracts were completed, there would be no more. So it ended up being eventually we're going to stop immigration from the United States. Secondly, Tehran called for placing a major Mexican military presence in Texas. And this would end up being a sort of series of forts, not in the Tejano areas, not in San Antonio and Goya, but in East Texas, as a bulwark against future American incursions. Third, the law, again, based upon Tehran's recommendations, had a number of measures that were supposed to encourage immigration from Europe and from the interior of Mexico. The idea being to someday sort of delete Anglo-American influence. And finally, a period of free trade between the United States and Texas was going to be allowed to end. So these are the circumstances that would eventually the law of April 6 planted the seeds of discontent and distrust. Even though the law would eventually be repealed, by the time that happens, relations between Anglo-Texans and the central government in Mexico has deteriorated really probably to the point of no return. But that's of course going to be the topic of your next session with Professor Linda English, I believe, said in a week or so. So I have used up my time here, but I just want to sort of reiterate the main points that I tried to make with our essential question. Why did Americans come? Well, they came because of changes in land policy and hard times in the United States. Why did Mexico allow them to come? Well, they thought Anglo immigrants would be good Indian fighters, push back the Comanches. They were in some ways right about that. Here's those. And most of all, Mexico understood that this newly independent, economically devastated country needed productive tax-paying citizens, and they saw Anglo-Americans as not only good Indian fighters, but people who would develop the economy. They would bring this cotton boom to northern Mexico, and Texas, which is this godforsaken outpost of the far northern Mexican frontier, would end up being another Mississippi, only under the Mexican flag. And that, of course, is why the Mexican government, at least at the state level, continued to make these allowances for slavery and the quasi-slavery of indentured servitude for life. Only when the national government seemed committed to interfering with this vision of a productive, slave-owning, cotton-growing Anglo-Texas under the Mexican flag, only when it became apparent that that was not the long-term goal of the government in Mexico City, did the events that would soon lead to the Texas Revolution really begin to unfold. And with that, my time is out, and I will turn this back over to our host.